Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Kline. As Lindsay said, I'm been retired now from DEC Rivers program for about 5 years now, going on 5 years anyway. And when I was at the department, I managed the state rivers program for about 10 years. Served as a state river scientist for 10 or so years before that. Um, Started a lot of the stream geomorphic assessments, river corridor plans in Vermont, working with watershed groups and other organizations to try to get a better understanding of our rivers and how dynamic they are and what that means to the things that we all care about and the critters in the stream and whatnot. Um, I guess one thing I will mention, and I chatted with Lindsay a little bit about this before, um, a lot of you joined, is about, well, now over 22 years ago, um, I started all my work in stream dynamics, working on a section of the Trout River just below Montgomery Center, and worked on the trout for 3 years. That three-mile segment just below the village. And it was quite a learning laboratory for me. Folks like Jim, who's on the call, joined us there for a few days, and of course John was around during that time. And I'd love to go up there with all of you sometime and take a walk. I stayed away from that site for about a decade because it didn't look like it was turning out the way we planned. But now I go up there and it's beautiful. I wish I had planned it. At least in my mind, it's beautiful. The beaver have taken over, and it's really something up there. Anyway, I'll get started with my presentation and share my screen. Lindsay, I'm going to be in full screen mode. If you see a hand go up or someone puts something in the chat, a question, don't hesitate to say, "Hey, Mike, we got a question,"
You
and,
got it.
and I'll stop.
Thanks, Mike.
So here we go. All right, can folks see my screen?
There it goes. Yes, now we can.
All right, I'm going to blow this, see if I can blow this up. Here we go. So Sarah asked me to do a talk on river dynamics and floodplains. And so what I'd like to do is start off really kind of trying to answer the question, why do we care about river dynamics? The fact that rivers move in our landscape. Why is that important? How does it happen? And I kind of like this stream pyramid, uh, stream functions pyramid that was put together by stream mechanics. It really shows the top of the pyramid is something I think we all care about quite a bit. The biodiversity that's in our healthy aquatic systems, the interactions between the different communities, the microbial, macrophyte, benthic fish communities, how they interact to form an aquatic ecosystem. And you could put at the top of this pyramid other things that we all care about. Water quality and all the services that good water quality provides for us. You could also put at the top of this pyramid flood resiliency and drought resiliency, and the ability of our communities to, get back on their feet after big flood events that cause inundation and erosion or drought that parches our landscape. All of these different services, could be at the top of this pyramid, and they are supported by the hydrology and geomorphology, the physical dynamics of a system that really starts with the geology and the climate that exist in any given location. What are the landforms? How much precipitation, and in what form? What times of the year? How does that water move through the watershed? At the very base of this pyramid is the hydrology, the magnitude, the frequency, the timing, and duration of flows. How big are those flows? How often do they occur? What's the timing? What time of year do those flows occur? How long does a storm last? All of these different parameters of flow then dictate the combinations of flow, velocity, and depth, or the hydraulics of the channel. The hydrology and hydraulics, how much flow is coming through the channel, and based on the geography of the watershed, how fast is it flowing and how deep is it flowing. These parameters then dictate how the quantity and size of different sediment and wood are moving through the system, how that material is sorted out in the channel and in the floodplain. How is it distributed between different features within the river? These are sometimes you hear stream ecologists or stream geomorphologists talk about river processes. These three hydrogeomorphic characteristics, the base of the pyramid, really dictate these processes, commonly known as erosion and deposition. How different sediments are picked up and moved, how wood is moved through the system. All three of these things, the hydrology, the hydraulics, and the geomorphology, these materials that move down through the river channel and through the floodplain, really dictate the physical habitat within the aquatic system, within the floodplain system. If you can think about, what are some of the key habitat, components that make for a healthy community, let's say a fish community that we all can think of. Think about, the temperature component of habitat. How connected is that channel to its riparian, to the trees that are growing next to it? How are sediments, the trees, of course, providing shade? How are the sediments and wood moving through the system that move the flow back and forth in the valley? We think of a meandering stream. It's those riverbanks with the deep pools that create cover, which provide cool water for our fish species. So all of these different components of temperature, habitat are driven by the connectivity of the floodplain and riparian, as dictated by how sediment is moved through the watershed at different times of year through different flows, moving at different velocities and depths. And the same is true for different cover habitats and reproductive habitats. If a stream dries up during critical times of fish migration, and fish cannot get to their spawning habitat, that age class will fail. So the physical piece of habitat is driven by the distribution of sediment and wood as moved by the water. And this other component of the pyramid is the physicochemical. Again, they mentioned the functions of temperature here is being critical, as well as how the fine sediments form the soils and the floodplains characteristics that then filter and process different organic material and nutrients. So the physical really is a large driver of the natural chemical processes that protect water quality. Many of you are familiar with all the work that we're doing to minimize nutrient loading into Lake Champlain. You know, the Missisquoi River is a big target in that process. As you know, and many of the projects that we're engaged in is trying to get better storage of water and sediment and nutrient in different components of the watershed. That storage is all about how sediments are distributed by the flow and hydraulics of the river. So when we're creating floodplains, removing berms, all of these things that reconnect the hydrology, making culverts larger, removing dams, all those different projects that we all think about all the time in terms of restoring our watersheds are affecting these erosion and deposition processes. And in our case, we're trying to drive towards a greater storage of these sediments, wood, and nutrient in different parts of our watershed. If I have confused everybody at this point, please ask questions, because I'm going to move on to trying to explain these same pieces and why they can be so dynamic. Right here, I'm showing, Lane's balance. A guy by the name of Lane in 1955 came up with this figure, which many geomorphologists have used to try to explain this hydrology, hydraulics, geomorphology, and how that drives the system. You'll see that I've put the two parts of this balance, or what is being balanced on either beam here, is the hydraulic load, or that magnitude, frequency, timing, and duration of flows, as balanced with the quantity, size, sorting, and distribution of sediment and wood. All right, so those are the two main things that are counterbalancing each other. The other pieces of the balance are stream power, which is a function of the stream slope. All right, imagine a very straight stream in a narrow valley having a steep slope versus a very low gradient valley where the stream is meandering and has a very low gradient. Well, the combination of that gradient and the amount of water moving through that channel and floodplain dictate how much power the water has during, let's say, floods. All right. What counterbalances that stream power is the resistance that exists at any given point in the watershed. And resistance is a function of the size of the material and the quantity of material that's in the system. So it's these four pieces of this balance that allows us to really understand how the system might work at any given time in different flood situations. The last piece, I mentioned erosion and deposition, or erosion and inundation, as being sort of the outcome of this dynamicism. I'm going to give you some examples here. Let's say we come into a watershed and we add all sorts of roads, and all those roads have ditches, and a lot of the streams then flow into those ditches, and now the water in a given storm, instead of percolating through the landscape and through all the vegetation, is being shunted into the stream channel and into the river channel very quickly. your magnitude goes up, and your duration is shortened. All right. So you have now increased the weight of this balance on this side, tilting it towards degradation and erosion of the channel. So when we increase the flows coming into the channel through diversions or ditches, we are going to increase the power of the stream, and it will likely result in erosion. All right. Another example, if a stream is straightened back 120 years ago, if you didn't ditch the streams on your land, your neighbor go to the select board and get permission to go on your land and straighten your streams for you. That used to be a law in Vermont. And so a lot of our small streams, in fact, a lot of our big rivers were straightened over time. Not so much anymore, but by increasing the slope, we increase the stream power. That's made this channel more erosive. It's swung the balance towards erosion. So various activities that have happened to our Vermont rivers and streams, including, the Siskoy and Trout rivers, I might add, increase that stream power and the erosiveness of the flows in the channel. Now, when you increase, the erosion, you will start building up sediment, and that buildup of sediment then will swing the balance in the opposite direction. And eventually the load increases during a flood to the point where as soon as it hits any kind of lower slope, let's say behind a bridge or culvert that slows it down momentarily, all that sediment is going to drop out. It's going to agrade the bed. So after a flood, when you see these big wedges of sediment in the channel, it's because you had an increase of erosion upstream, and the river hit a slow point in the valley, either by some structure or even a big bend in the river, and all that sediment falls out, and the channel agrades. And that's when you get an increase in inundation. The river leaves the channel and comes up, often flooding things that we care about in our villages. So different activity, different thing. These processes happen by nature. Of course, you get a huge flood, even in a natural watershed, it's going to tip the balance, for some amount of time. But what we have seen in rivers all over the world is that the stream channel forms a relationship with the floodplain such that such that you minimize the increases in depth that you might see in a flood. And when you decrease that depth, you spread the water out on a floodplain, you decrease the power. And the relationship between the channel and the floodplain then is a predictable relationship that minimizes the swings in this balance. Streams are dynamic; they're always eroding and and aggrading the channel back and forth in different flood events that occur. But generally, over time, that sorting and distribution of materials forms a geometry that minimizes those swings. And so Vermont has adopted a policy that we are managing toward dynamic stream equilibrium. We know streams don't just sit here at zero. They move. But we are trying to minimize the extent to which we increase this load beyond its natural load. We do not increase the slope of the channel, or increase or decrease the slope of the channel from what it should be in the type of valley that it's sitting in. We try to minimize the amount that we're over dredging some of our rivers, because when we dredge, we're taking out a certain size and quantity of material, and that causes the resistance to go down. When the resistance go down, guess what? It erodes again. And so all of these things that people, have defined the relationship between people and rivers, in the past, may affect one component of this dynamic balance or the other. And when we can minimize, or when we can manage towards a natural stream equilibrium, we increase the storage in our watershed. We increase the habitat diversity and the biodiversity. We store nutrients and carbon on our floodplains and within our stream channels, and we minimize our exposure to erosion and inundation that is going to happen, in any given flood. I've kind of summarized, many of the historic activities that have driven that balance towards the erosion side of the equation. When the state was deforested, or 100 years ago, 120 years ago, there was not only a dramatic increase in the magnitude of runoff that was occurring, there was also a tremendous load of sediment that occurred at that time in the gulling that brought down a massive amount of sediment. When I had an archaeologist come and look at some of the banks along the Trout River with me, to do any kind of bank work, we had to have an archaeologist sign off. He looked at and saw that there was 4 to 5 feet of recent alluvium on top of an old leaf litter layer that you could see way down in the bottom of the bank, which was the original floodplain of the Trout River. So that deforestation period brought down almost 4 to 5 feet of sediment from the hill slopes into the valley, and smothered the Trout River in that location. I looked at some of the aerial photos from I believe it was even before the 50s. And the Trout River was just swirling all over the place, which is what streams do when they're smothered with sediment. They are essentially trying to increase the channel depth to move that sediment. But that was intolerable to the early landowners that were trying to make a living in the valley. And you look at the 1960s aerial photo, and the Trout River was straighter than an arrow. It had been straightened and steepened, and that's really a condition that it's been responding to ever since. And all these various things then happen to many of our streams. When a stream is straightened, and then we put infrastructure next to it, a rail bed, or a road or a village or what have you, that stream is going to stay straightened forever, probably. And that affects then how that sediment and wood moves through that system and affects the channel just downstream, and so forth. So we ended up in an erosive condition where storage was lost. Our floodplain, our channels became disconnected from their floodplain, and that's what I'm showing here is evolution of a channel. It starts out, up here at this what's called stable stage 1 of the evolutionary process, where that relationship of the channel to the floodplain that's been formed over time, given the climate the valley geometry and the sediment supply and the flows, you get this floodplain forming where the channel is deep enough to move a lot of the fine materials, but it's not so deep that it has the stream power to move what we think of as the backbone of the stream. If you look at a meandering stream, in between those river bends is this feature that an angler calls a riffle. It's where macroinvertebrates love to grow. But that coarser material between the outside bends is really what holds that bed profile. And that the depth of this channel isn't strong enough during flood to move those coarser materials. So that riffle stays. It might move from one part of the valley to another, but the elevation of it stays pretty much where it is. Well, when you increase the erosivity of the channel, you cut through that backbone. You move those coarser materials in that riffle, and the channel goes down. And now, during a flood, a 25, 50, 100-year flood, I've seen it all across Vermont, it stays in the channel. It doesn't get out on the floodplain. Well, that's now you've really increased the depth and probably in a straightened channel, so your stream power is at a maximum. Well, it keeps going down until that bed gets coarse, and the bed becomes more resistant to erosion than the banks, and the banks start eroding, and the channel starts widening. And this widening process continues, and you start to see these small floodplains forming in that deepened widening channel, and eventually you get that original channel floodplain geometry back if left alone. All right, so this is the channel evolution process. It happens in nature. It occurs naturally, but people, through these various activities, have driven this channel evolution process into hyperdrive. And so what we've seen, we've assessed over 2,300 miles of stream and river in Vermont, and 73.5% of our streams are in these deepened and widening stages of channel evolution. And so if our villages are next to this, our roads are next to this, our crops are next to this, we're seeing a lot of channel movement that's very destructive in our view to these investments. It's a challenge to find ways that we can move back and allow this channel evolution process to continue. Up until Tropical Storm Irene, all the way up through the floods of the 70s and 90s, a channel would go from this stage 2 or 3 into stage 4 during a big flood, and we'd go in and push it right back up to stage 2 of the channel evolution process, trying to put everything back just the way it was in our lifetimes or our fathers' lifetimes. And not necessarily the way it was 150 years ago or 200 years ago. So this is a big challenge that we're dealing with in the state. This is a famous picture of Route 4 just up in Mendon, Vermont, above Rutland. Happened during Tropical Storm Irene. Mendon Brook, many of you may know that stream. And it was sandwiched between a highway and the valley wall. This highway embankment came down here, and you had the steep valley wall coming down here. And a lot of the floodplain was filled to create room for this highway. Well, the brook took its floodplain back in Irene. And so did the work to come back and get this highway back in service, where we could, instead of just filling out into this floodplain at a 2-on-1 slope, which is what the engineers would typically call for as a stable slope, we tried to go vertical with bigger rock. And by going vertical, we left as much room for a new floodplain for this stream as we could during that reconstruction. Costs a little bit more money, but the idea was to not only make the highway more resilient, but to support a lot of these other functions that I talked about in the pyramid. So we try to preserve river form floodplains as much as possible to lessen the amount of erosion and downstream flooding that we see. I wanted to kind of go back to this concept of and drive it home a little bit more here. This erosive power is a function of the stream slope and the discharge or the depth. All right. And this, shows an example of where a stream that had a very gentle slope may have been straightened, and now it had a much steeper slope than it did before. And this often leads to a loss of lateral connectivity. And that loss of lateral connectivity, you end up trying to maintain this steeper slope over time. And if this channel is armored to protect different investments that go in along that overpowered, it's just gonna, whatever sediments come through, you're not gonna see any deposition and storage of materials in this part of the valley anymore. It's gonna move those materials right down to the next segment of stream or river, and at the first opportunity for that energy to be expanded, it will be expanded. And so I liken it, some of our response to this, we're chasing our rivers with riprap, trying to save our investments that have cut off the lateral connectivity of a stream and its floodplain. And looking at the other side of the stream power equation, the depth, again, a flood in a channel that has a good connection to its floodplain, especially a forested floodplain, is going to have a lot less power than the same flood that's contained within the channel, can't get out onto the floodplain, and it will begin that channel evolution process. I mentioned drought. This is kind of this diagram kind of gives us a little insight into why many of our incised, deepened channels in Vermont might increase the severity of drought when a channel is in that second or third stage of the evolutionary process. It's downcut, it's widening. The water table lowers with that lower flow level. And that often gets below a lot of the vegetation, the roots of the vegetation growing on the floodplain, or on what is now an abandoned floodplain. And so many of our soils become ever more parched next to incised channels where you see a depressed water table. This is a loss of vertical connectivity in the system. It's become more erosive. So trying to now go to a little bit of the positive. What are we trying to do about this? One of the big things that we learned, in fact, it was a lesson I learned up again on the Trout River. We got the Trout River back into some beautiful meanders that it had formed at some point, in the thinking that we had the right slope and the right floodplain connection. And flood came through about 2 years after we finished the project and wiped out about half of it. Things just had not glued together yet, and it ripped right down through a lot of the structures that we built. And I sat on the riverbank, and my boss came up to me and said, you look pretty down, Mike. Are you kind of against doing this work now?" And I said, well, the one thing that succeeded in this whole thing is the corridor of land that we protected along the river in our agreements with the landowners. And so even though the river is not where we put it, it's in this protected corridor. And that really started all of our work then to design what would be the amount of space a river needs to get to this stable geometry, to get to an equilibrium slope and depth that it can maintain over time, that would minimize the amount of erosion that occurs and increase the storage. And so in the last 10 years, particularly since Irene, the state has mapped river corridors for all the streams and rivers in the state. For streams greater than 2 square miles, it actually delineated this meander belt and buffered area, to define, in our wider lower gradient valleys, how much space a given river might need based on its landforms and hydrology. For our smaller streams, it's more of a simple setback. They generally are steeper and straighter anyway. But these river corridors were recognized by the legislature after Irene, and the state jurisdiction over protecting them. But mostly, it's incentives trying to work with towns at this point to protect and minimize the degree of encroachments that would continue to occur, that would force us into maintaining these oversteepened channels, and the loss of floodplain and storage function. So that's one of the main tools that we're using now. And you can see basically drawn it at the edge of that floodplain reforming process here on the diagram. So the hydrogeomorphology of a stream that ultimately dictates the habitat, the biodiversity, and the healthy aquatic systems, that dictate the storage function of our watersheds, that keep our streams and lakes cleaner, and really minimizes the flood and erosion damage that we've been experiencing, is something that we can approach by paying attention to connectivity. The connectivity of a river with its floodplain will then drive these processes towards that natural dynamic equilibrium. So we pay attention to, I just got done talking about longitudinal connectivity, lateral connectivity, where we talked about keeping the corridor open to the degree that we can to allow our deepened and straightened channels time to reform a relationship with a floodplain, to minimize that stream power, that erosive stream power. And the challenges that go with that, particularly for us who use our valley floors. That's very much related to vertical connectivity, but we are busy looking for areas that we can take down old berms. We can restore floodplains. I don't know that there's been any particular projects up north. I'm trying to remember now. If somebody can yell out one if they do remember, but we're going into a lot of the the urban or village areas, and where we can find places that are now no longer in use. We are actually building floodplains, lowering the elevation of that terrace down to meet that channel floodplain depth during flood, to take some of the erosive power out of the flood and minimize the inundation that then happens downstream. For instance, the River Conservancy just finished like a 12-acre floodplain project down just outside of the village of Brattleboro. And that project has been modeled to reduce inundation damage in downtown Brattleboro by 4 feet. So a 12-acre floodplain project resulting in a 4-foot lower depth in inundation could save millions in a big flood on the Whetstone Brook. We did the same thing in Bennington on the Roaring Branch. Northfield, Vermont, we did a 3-acre floodplain restoration that dropped flood levels by a foot, or half a foot, I mean. And so some of these vertical connectivity projects are becoming popular, and if strategically located, can really minimize some of the damage that we see. Longitudinal connectivity is also very popular. We're increasing the size of our culverts and bridges. It's expensive, but when you think about this quantity, size, sorting, and distribution of sediment and wood, if a stream transporting sediment and wood hits an undersized culvert, backs up, and all that material drops out, now you've got an imbalance between the amount of water and the available sediments downstream of that structure. You've created what's called hungry water. And the erosion below an undersized culvert can be dramatic. And so you get flooding above and erosion below. That longitudinal connectivity, taking out derelict dams that are no longer in use, increasing the size of our stream crossings, all of these things increase the unimpeded movement of material down through the system, so that as the stream naturally picks up sediment and wood, it can be replaced by the material that's coming from upstream. Very important. And I also mentioned temporal connectivity. A lot of the stormwater projects that we're engaged in, a lot of the work that our town road crews are doing to improve ditching practices, all of these activities are decreasing the extent to which we've increased the magnitude of the peak floods. So those types of projects affect the temporal connectivity. Several of us just worked on a project called the Functioning Floodplain Initiative, which really looks at and measures the degree to which all of these different types of connectivity have been changed in any given reach of river down through the system. And it's allowed us to say, okay, if we're going to take this berm out and increase the availability of floodplain to the stream, that's going to increase vertical and lateral connectivity, and possibly even temporal connectivity, the storage of flood water, and that storage could result in a certain amount of nutrient load reduction down through the system to Lake Champlain, which is driving a lot of the grant programs that many of us are pursuing projects along the river. So this concept of connectivity and how that relates to the natural functioning and the dynamic equilibrium of our streams is very much driving our water quality remediation and restoration work in the state, which will then have the co-benefits of flood resiliency and biodiversity. So that's my little presentation. And I will stop sharing and be happy to answer questions if I can.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. That was great. And those were some neat visuals I hadn't seen before. Sarah and I were involved in a very small reconnectivity project with the Land Trust this year, and Shane Jaquith came out. We got to play beaver on a little stream in Sheldon, and it was really fun to do, and it'll be exciting to go back and see how that reconnection works. And
recognizing the role of wood in our streams for not only providing direct cover for aquatic organisms, but how it affects the movement of sediment and other wood through the system, ultimately building up the bed of the stream. And it's another way of reconnecting that incised channel to what was its historic floodplain. So raising the bed by the addition of wood and these beaver analogs is a cool new project type that folks are doing.
I have a question, but I want to make sure everybody else gets a chance, and I want to run the show here.
I have a question. It's Jen.
Okay.
Really, really great. I really appreciate this presentation. So I guess what I'm thinking, in light of the flooding that we've had, recently in Vermont and the history of it, is how does Vermont, like, what are other states doing? Are we being more proactive, more preventative? Are we doing something that other states are not doing? How is this kind of like, how do we compare across the nation to what we're doing? Or are other people starting to get on board with, looking at these types of things in terms of, the wood and the sediment and the flow and that type of thing?
There are certainly hotbeds of different, excellent work going on all over the country. Different parts of the country, really stand out as being leaders in some of this work. Some of the beaver analog work we were just talking about came out of the West, the Southwest, all the way up through Montana. Different biologists were learning about reintroducing beaver and how that affected stream geomorphology. Many states are doing dam removals, trying to restore that longitudinal connectivity of rivers. Some of them excelling at that. I think Vermont can proudly say that we've advanced some of the erosion hazard work through river corridor protection as much or more than most other states across the country. There's several states that are also involved in that area, but this idea of how much space can we give our rivers and how do we begin to improve that lateral connectivity and that floodplain relationship is something that I think we're probably on the edge of that curve, across the country. Some of the statutory language that I had up on the screen there is stuff I don't think you'd find anywhere else in the country. In terms of stated policy of managing our streams toward a dynamic equilibrium. So we've done some good work here, but we are learning from our neighbors as well.
That's great. Are we able to get like a link to this to be able to review it again? Is this something that we'll be able to access?
Yeah, Jen, I can send out, I have a PDF version of the slides that I can send out to the committee members to view afterwards.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I really appreciate this presentation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mike, my question had to do with something you said early on in the talk about dredging. And I feel like that's a conversation that probably happens every time there's a flood, but it's something that I'm hearing about is people saying, oh yeah, we used to just pull the sediment out and put it on the roads. And now we're losing our roads into the river. And now we're getting these shallow rivers, and right above Boston Post Bridge, now there's islands there where they didn't used to be. And I'm wondering if you have any tips about how to address that. It was really cool to hear you say like, oh, the you're taking out a certain size and a certain quantity of the sediment, and it just replaces itself. So
Yeah. Well, there's no question that by energizing our river system, we and all this erosion I kept bringing up over and over again, we're generating material in these channels probably over and above what was generated historically in a more naturally, quote unquote, stable channel. So there's no doubt, and that sediment has to go somewhere, and you do see it after floods, and the way I have dealt with it is, certainly if there's a buildup of gravel or wood in a place where it's directing flow that impinges on someone's house or impinges on a village, or is about to take out a bridge, the river engineers in Vermont are going to work with people to go in and do a certain amount of gravel removal. And that happens after every flood. So there's not this total ban on gravel removal that people sometimes mention. It's really driven by public safety. Where do we see grading channels where there's a real public safety concern? We're going to get in there and deal with that and make people safe. However, having said that, that sediment that's generating is the material that's going to form that new floodplain that in that later stages of the evolutionary process. If we go in and over dredge after a flood, we're basically sending it back to the beginning of the process. And where we can work with landowners. And this is why we do the river corridor easement. We recognize that this natural evolutionary process is not what a landowner signed on for. But to the extent that we can leave that material in those new bars, you're seeing the formation of what it will be a functioning floodplain someday. And that's going to stabilize the whole system. That's going to minimize the damage for everyone. In Irene, well, let me start back. Well, after Irene, I felt very, very strongly that most of the damage that we saw, well, it was the May floods up in your area, but Irene down south. Most of that damage was because of what we did in the channels in the 1970s, in the 73 and the 76 flood, where we took World War II surplus bulldozers and we ran them right down the valley, clearing out the channels, deepening them, setting up this channel geometry where the next flood, the next big flood that was contained within that erodible channel was just going to blow everything out. Now, some of that hit up your way in the 90s. We had a series of devastating floods up on the Trout in the 90s. A lot of that erosion that occurred there was because we didn't have functioning floodplains along the Trout. So what looks bad to us because it's change is actually part of a healing process. And where we can let it play out, where we again work with landowners, to let that play out, help them, get do an easement or whatever, then that's going to heal the whole system.
Just Lindsay, the spot that you mentioned above the post road, in connection with Mike's graphics and stuff, the roadside 105 is also where the old railroad bed goes, which is now the rail trail. The other side of the river has had no vegetation on it until just recently it's starting to show. But if you look at old pictures around the post road, the river bed itself was quite a bit narrower than it is now. And I like to think of the fact that it's creating islands, and that's going to be natural habitat. And, it's not easy to argue with people are convinced that you got to go in and scoop it out.
One thing I think we can explore, and maybe we will try to start these conversations, is that post road bridge is no longer wide enough for the river. So when it's up for replacement, that's going to be, I know there's a lot of emotion tied to that bridge, but that's going to be a conversation of how to make a bigger bridge there so we don't.
Certain areas of our watershed, and I didn't get into this, but there's certain areas of, not this dynamic equilibrium plays out differently in different parts of the river system. All right. And so what might be an equilibrium in a steep mountain gradient stream is very different where that mountain stream hits the valley floor, and then very different further down. That place in the valley where the stream comes down and starts to flatten out, that is a naturally a grading area where deposition is going to increase dramatically. So you have places in watersheds where they're just sediment dumps, and they always are, and they always will be. But that sediment that dumps out there is what feeds the system over time during smaller floods. It's what creates the bed profiles that then create cover for macroinvertebrates and fish. And so when we put infrastructure right at one of those creases, and we're constantly in there taking the material out to protect that investment, we're affecting all the habitat downriver that depends on that site as a feeder for materials during the lesser floods. And so I can think of many places. Like the town of Bennington's built on alluvial fan, right? The whole part of the valley is one big sediment dump, and the city is sitting right on top of it. And so they're constantly fighting the roaring branch. And so, where we have bridges that have been placed in these locations, those are the few that we sometimes do have to overbuild if we want to keep them there, to allow for that sediment movement and that sediment storage. And the stream alteration standards in Vermont really spell that out, that in most cases we can get by with what we call a bank full channel width on a structure. But in a depositional zone, we're going to need to go wider.
Mike, I just wanted to thank you for a great presentation. Wonderful to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And thanks for helping us, just think about river process a little more. The fact that erosion is part of the natural processes on channels, and just to think about working to preserve the erodible corridor that there are places where we don't have opportunities to do that kind of thing, and so understanding where there may be opportunities to go ahead and preserve the corridor, super valuable, super important, to help minimize the effects on important infrastructure and houses and all that kind of thing. I wonder if you could speak just briefly to any thoughts or observations that you have about how climate change may affect some of the rivers and streams in Vermont, and particularly the main stem trout and Missisquoi, as well as maybe some of the tribs there.
Sure. Well, we go to the base of the pyramid, right? The magnitude is going to be affected by climate change. These microburst storms that are bringing 6 inches, 9 inches of rain. It's going to increase the magnitude of the flow. We're getting them more frequently. They're longer duration. Almost every component of that hydrology is being affected by the types of storm systems that we're now seeing in Vermont, the channel, what was the channel and floodplain relationship is going to change. And it's going to change at a much faster rate than what it would typically. So we're going to see enlarging channels, and we're going to see change that occurs at a much faster rate than it might have otherwise. Some of these channel evolution processes that I showed in cross-section, they might happen over 40, 60, 80, 100 years, depending on the type, the texture of the soils and gravels that form the floodplains and terraces. And I think you're going to see that channel evolution process happen much more rapidly. And so protecting those open corridors that we have left in Vermont. And I think we have way more than many other states do, quite frankly. We have an opportunity to minimize the impacts of climate change because we still have open lands next to our rivers. If we don't give that some hard thinking in the next couple of years, we're talking about we need 10 times more housing and we need this and we need that, if it all goes in the valley floor and we end up confining our streams and rivers that much more in a changing climate. Remember, climate was at the very, very base of the pyramid, right? It's what drove everything. And if our climate is changing, we can expect change in our streams and rivers. And my advice to my old colleagues and peers is, let's work to give them the space that we can while we can.